Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Crawl Space. Lia woke because something was scratching inside the bedroom wall, and for several seconds she lay completely still while trying to decide whether the sound belonged to a mouse, old pipework, or timber shifting as the house cooled overnight. The noise came from behind the large wardrobe on Ross's side of the room, where a section of wall separated their bedroom from part of the older structure, and it continued in a slow, irregular rhythm that was too deliberate to blend into the ordinary sounds of the house. There would be a faint scrape, then a pause, followed by another movement that seemed to travel a few inches before stopping again, as though something were adjusting its position carefully rather than simply running through a cavity. Lia turned towards Ross and considered waking him, but before she moved, another sound came through the wall that immediately changed the way she interpreted the scratching. Something heavier shifted behind the plaster, producing a dull pressure against the timber, followed by the faint brush of material against insulation. The sound was not loud, but it carried the unmistakable sense of weight, and Lia found herself imagining a person trying to move through a space barely large enough to contain them without making enough noise to be heard. She reached across and touched Ross's shoulder, waking him quietly, before whispering that something was moving behind the wardrobe. Ross sat up and listened while Lia pointed towards the wall, although by the time he was fully awake, the noise had stopped. He remained silent for nearly a minute, and eventually suggested that an animal might have entered the cavity somewhere near the roof or extension, which was plausible enough in a house that had been altered several times over the decades. Lia agreed because she wanted an explanation that belonged to ordinary life, although she continued staring towards the wardrobe after Ross lay back down and did not properly sleep for the rest of the night. The following morning, Ross moved the wardrobe away from the wall so he could inspect the area where Lia had heard the scratching. The couple had only lived in the property for a few months and were still discovering small details left behind by previous renovations, so neither was particularly surprised when Ross noticed a rectangular outline beneath several layers of paint. What did surprise them was the small recessed handle hidden beneath the edge of the frame, which revealed that the panel had once been designed to open. After cutting through the paint around the edges, Ross carefully pulled the panel outward and exposed a narrow opening into a dark void behind the wall. The access space was considerably smaller than either of them expected, with old timber supports, pipes, insulation, and dust filling an area that looked barely wide enough for an adult to enter on hands and knees. In several places, the gap appeared lower still, meaning anyone attempting to move deeper into it would have to crawl on elbows rather than simply crouch. Ross shone a torch inside and saw nothing that immediately explained the noise. There were no obvious nests, droppings, or signs of animal damage near the entrance, although the dust across the floor had been disturbed in several places. Lia initially assumed the marks belonged to whatever animal had been moving during the night, but when Ross lowered himself closer to the opening, he noticed impressions that were much larger and more evenly spaced than paw prints. One mark looked disturbingly like the heel of a hand pressed into dust, while another resembled the shallow indentation left by a knee. Ross entered the crawl space far enough to inspect the immediate area, keeping his legs near the opening while Lia remained beside the wardrobe with the torch trained ahead. He found nothing beyond old construction debris and sections of pipework, but the disturbed dust continued farther into the darkness where the passage turned behind another section of wall. When Ross returned to the bedroom, he suggested that builders or previous owners might have used the space during renovation work and left marks that had remained preserved, even though both of them understood that the dust near the entrance looked much too recently disturbed for that explanation to feel completely satisfying. The scratching returned 2 nights later and sounded more physical than it had before. Lia woke first again and listened as something moved from behind the wardrobe towards the wall near the bathroom, with the noise traveling slowly enough that she could follow its progress through the structure. there was the faint pressure of a hand against timber, followed by fabric dragging over insulation, and then another heavier movement that sounded like a knee settling onto a board. Ross heard it this time as well, and the couple remained awake until the sound faded somewhere beyond the far side of the bedroom. They contacted a pest control company the next morning, and an inspector spent nearly an hour examining the access space, loft, and exterior of the property. He found several places where small animals might theoretically enter around older sections of roofing, but there was no nest, droppings, or other evidence of anything large living behind the walls. He suggested that expanding timber, pipe vibration, or a combination of minor issues might account for some of the sounds, although he admitted that the impressions in the dust did not resemble anything he could confidently attribute to rodents. For several days after that inspection, Ross and Lia experienced nothing unusual enough to justify further concern. Then, small things around the house began changing in ways that neither could explain with confidence. A kitchen cupboard was found open after both remembered closing it. A bathroom window was discovered unlatched one morning, despite Ross checking it the previous evening, and a packet of biscuits disappeared from the cupboard, only to turn up half empty beneath the utility sink. Lia initially assumed Ross had moved things without thinking, while Ross assumed the same about her, but neither became suspicious of the other because the incidents were too trivial and inconsistent to justify an argument. The situation changed when Ross opened the crawl space panel again to check whether the dust had been disturbed. Near the entrance, lying partly beneath a piece of insulation, he found an empty plastic water bottle with a distinctive label from the multi-pack they had bought several days earlier. Lia recognized it immediately because the bottles were still stacked in the kitchen, and when Ross reached farther inside, he found a crumpled food wrapper from a snack Lia knew had been taken from the same cupboard. Neither item belonged in the crawl space. Ross backed away from the opening and closed the panel before either of them spent much time discussing possibilities, because the most obvious explanation had become difficult to avoid. Someone had been inside the space recently enough to take food and water from their kitchen, which meant either a person had accessed the house without their knowledge or somebody had discovered another route into the hidden structure. They called the police, and the response became considerably more serious once officers saw the access panel, disturbed dust and household items recovered from inside. The house was searched thoroughly while another officer examined the crawl space as far as the structure allowed, eventually discovering that the void extended much farther than Ross and Lia had realized. Older renovations had created several interconnected spaces between the original house and later additions, forming a narrow route that passed behind sections of the bedroom, bathroom, spare room, and upper hallway before reaching an older service area near the rear extension. The layout was awkward but believable rather than maze-like, and officers explained that someone familiar with the structure could move between several parts of the house without entering the main rooms. More disturbing still, the thin walls and vents meant a person inside would be able to hear conversations from much of the upper floor, including the bedroom. Police found no intruder during the search and no obvious sleeping area near the sections they could safely access, but they treated the possibility of repeated unlawful entry as credible and advised Ross and Lia to secure the bedroom panel while investigators examined the property's history and external access points. Ross screwed a temporary board over the panel that evening, while police arranged for a more thorough inspection of the voids and the rear service area. For several nights, the house remained completely quiet, and Lia began to believe that the increased attention had frightened whoever was using the space away. The confidence lasted until she woke shortly after 3 a.m. to the sound of movement directly behind the wardrobe. Ross was asleep beside her, and Lia did not wake him immediately because the crawling was so close that any movement in the room felt too loud. Something approached the secured access point from inside the wall with slow, deliberate motions, each shift separated by enough silence that Lia could picture the person pausing to listen. a hand or elbow pressed against timber behind the plaster, followed by the soft drag of fabric and the subtle creak of weight moving into the narrow area immediately behind the panel. The movement stopped. Lia remained motionless, while the silence continued long enough for her to wonder whether whoever was inside had realized the opening had been reinforced. Then an ordinary adult male voice spoke quietly through the wall and said her name. The voice contained no distortion, threat, or theatrical attempt to frighten her, which made the single word far more disturbing than anything elaborate could have been. Lia woke Ross without speaking loudly, and when she explained what she had heard, he called the police while keeping her away from the wardrobe. Officers returned quickly enough to search the property and crawl space again, but nobody was found by the time they entered. The second search uncovered a concealed exterior service hatch beneath part of the rear extension that had been disguised behind loose cladding and overgrown vegetation. The opening looked sealed from outside unless someone knew exactly where to press and lift, while from within the structure it connected with the same voids running behind the upper rooms. Investigators concluded that whoever had been entering the crawl space could have learned the layout before Ross and Lia moved into the house, particularly because the access route appeared to date from renovation work completed years earlier. Police installed temporary monitoring equipment and arranged for the external hatch to be secured properly, after which Ross and Lia stayed with Lia's sister for several nights. They returned only once. Officers confirmed that the property had been searched again and the suspected exterior access route had been reinforced, while a builder familiar with older properties was scheduled to permanently close several unnecessary void connections the following week. Neither Ross nor Lia particularly wanted to sleep there again, but they needed access to work clothes, documents, and possessions while arrangements were made, and the police had given them no reason to believe anyone remained inside. The first evening back passed without incident, although both were tense enough that ordinary creaks drew their attention. Shortly before midnight, Lia went downstairs to collect a bag from the kitchen, while Ross remained in the bedroom sorting clothes into boxes. He heard nothing unusual until a faint scraping noise travelled through the wall towards the rear of the house, and because the exterior service hatch had supposedly been secured, Ross initially assumed the builder's temporary supports were settling. Then Lia called from downstairs and asked whether he had moved something in the spare room. Ross stepped into the hallway and heard a heavier movement behind the wall. The sound travelled towards the section above the kitchen. He told Lia to remain downstairs and immediately called the police, explaining that someone might have re-entered the crawl space despite the secured hatch. The dispatcher confirmed officers were being sent, but Ross could still hear movement travelling through the void towards the rear section of the house, while Lia remained directly below. The access panel in the bedroom had been temporarily reopened earlier that day, so the builder could inspect measurements, and Ross made a decision he would later struggle to explain without sounding reckless. He knew the main external route had supposedly been secured. Police were already on their way, and Lia might be positioned close to wherever the intruder was attempting to emerge, while the narrow void provided the quickest route between Ross and the movement behind the kitchen. He told Lia to leave the house through the front door and wait outside, then took the torch and entered the crawl space. The passage felt considerably smaller once Ross moved beyond the area he had previously explored. He crawled on hands and knees initially, but several sections narrowed enough that he had to lower himself onto his elbows and pull forward while timber pressed close to his shoulders. The torch illuminated only a short distance ahead, revealing old insulation, pipes, and rough framing before the light disappeared around each turn. Ross could hear the building around him in unfamiliar ways, with water moving through pipes and distant traffic reduced to vibrations through timber, while every movement of his own body sounded loud enough to announce exactly where he was. After several meters, the passage widened slightly behind a section of the spare room, and Ross discovered a concealed recess partially hidden behind insulation. The space contained folded blankets, several empty water bottles, batteries, food wrappers, and a small torch, all arranged carefully enough to make it obvious that somebody had spent significant time there. Among the items were personal objects Ross recognized from around the house, including a screwdriver he had believed lost and one of Lia's old scarves. A small envelope lay beneath the blankets. Ross opened it and found several printed photographs. The first showed Lia standing beside the back door with shopping bags, apparently taken from somewhere outside the property. Another showed Ross working in the garden several weeks after they moved in, while a third had been taken through the living room window during an evening when both of them were sitting on the sofa. The final two photographs were different. They showed Ross and Lia asleep in their bedroom. The angle was low and slightly obstructed, consistent with a camera positioned near one of the concealed gaps beside the old access panel. The photographs had been taken on separate nights, and one clearly dated from before Lia first heard scratching inside the wall. Ross stared at the images long enough for the full implication to become unavoidable. Someone had been watching them sleep from within the structure long before they discovered the crawl space, while the ordinary objects and food wrappers around him suggested that the intruder had been living close enough to hear their conversations and learn their routines without either of them knowing. A faint sound came from behind Ross. He stopped moving and listened. Something pressed against timber several meters back along the passage, followed by the slow scrape of fabric across insulation. Ross turned his head as far as the narrow space allowed, but his shoulders were trapped closely enough between the framing that he could not rotate his body. His torch illuminated the darkness ahead, while the route behind remained outside his view, and another heavy movement confirmed that someone had entered the crawl space after him. The person behind Ross began crawling forward. Each movement was horribly distinct because the confined space amplified every physical detail, including a hand settling onto timber, a knee sliding several inches, and fabric catching against rough insulation before being pulled free. Ross started moving forward because there was no room to turn around and no practical way to defend himself from somebody approaching from behind, while the crawling followed at a steady pace that became gradually faster as the distance between them narrowed. Ross attempted to keep track of the passage using the rough layout police had described, remembering that the void should eventually connect with a section behind the spare room. The space tightened around his shoulders again, forcing him onto his elbows while the person behind continued gaining ground, and for the first time Ross heard breathing mixed with the movement. The sound was not panicked or exhausted, but controlled and close enough to make it obvious that another adult was now only several meters behind him. His torch beam caught a section of plasterboard ahead that looked newer than the surrounding timber, and Ross remembered the builder mentioning that one portion of the spare room wall had been added during later renovation work. He crawled towards it and began pressing his shoulder against the surface while continuing to hear the intruder approach. The first attempt produced only a dull crack, but Ross struck the same area again and felt part of the board shift beneath his weight. Lia heard the impacts from outside the house and remained on the phone with police while explaining that Ross was still inside the crawl space. The dispatcher told her not to re-enter the property, but when another heavy crack came from the upstairs spare room, Lia moved closer to the open front door so she could call to Ross without stepping inside. Ross heard her voice faintly through the wall and shouted that he was trying to break through into the spare room. The crawling behind him accelerated immediately after he spoke, making it clear that the intruder had also heard Lia and understood where Ross was attempting to escape. Ross drove his shoulder into the plasterboard again, widening the break enough for cold room air to reach him through the gap. A hand touched the sole of his shoe. Ross kicked backwards instinctively and felt his heel strike something solid, while the person behind him shifted and grabbed again. There was barely enough space for either man to move properly, and the confined struggle consisted mostly of Ross forcing himself forward while the intruder tried to gain hold of his ankle. Another impact against the wall finally broke a large section of plasterboard outward into the spare room. Ross pushed both arms through the opening and dragged his shoulders after them, tearing the board farther apart while the intruder pulled at one leg from behind. Lia heard Ross shouting and saw movement inside the spare room from the bottom of the stairs, but she remained near the front door and told the dispatcher that someone else was emerging behind him. Ross managed to pull himself through the broken wall and fell onto the spare room floor as the intruder reached the opening. For the first time, Ross saw the man who had been living around them. There was nothing monstrous about him. He appeared to be somewhere in his late 40s, thin enough that moving through the crawl space had become physically possible, with ordinary clothes covered in dust, plaster, and insulation fibers. His hair and beard were unkempt, and the skin around his hands was cracked from repeated contact with rough timber, but nothing about his face suggested anything other than a real human being who had spent far too long existing in places where nobody expected to find him. The man tried to pull himself through the broken opening, but Ross recovered quickly enough to kick the loose section of plasterboard back towards him and create enough obstruction to reach the hallway. Lia remained near the front entrance with the phone in one hand and a heavy torch in the other, and when Ross appeared at the top of the stairs, she shouted that police were less than a minute away. The intruder emerged from the spare room behind Ross and attempted to move towards the rear of the house rather than attack either of them directly. Ross realized he was trying to reach the service hatch or another concealed exit, while Lia stepped away from the route and kept herself between the man and the front door without approaching close enough to create an unnecessary confrontation. She switched on every downstairs light and shouted that police were already outside the street, which caused the intruder to hesitate long enough for Ross to block the hallway leading towards the rear extension. The man spoke only once, telling them quietly to move out of his way. His voice was the same ordinary male voice Lia had heard whispering her name from behind the wall. Neither Ross nor Lia attempted to argue with him, and when the first police car reached the property, Ross moved aside rather than trying to physically restrain the intruder himself. Officers entered through the open front door, ordered the man to the floor and arrested him before he could reach another access point. The investigation that followed eventually established that the intruder had worked for a subcontractor involved in renovation work on the house more than a decade earlier. His job had given him detailed knowledge of the voids created between the original building and later extensions, including the concealed service opening at the rear. Police believed he began using the empty property intermittently years later, entering through the hidden hatch and sleeping inside the structure before Ross and Lia purchased the house. By the time they moved in, he was already familiar with every route behind the walls and had simply continued returning. Nothing suggested he had chosen Ross or Lia because of a personal connection or complicated obsession before their arrival, because they had moved into a place where he already believed he belonged. Once they were there, his behavior became increasingly intrusive as he stole food, listened to conversations, and photographed them without being seen, while the narrow crawl spaces allowed him to remain only inches away from ordinary domestic life. Police recovered the photographs, personal items, and makeshift sleeping area, while the intruder remained in custody and was eventually charged with multiple offences connected to unlawful entry, stalking, and the invasion of Ross and Lia's home. Additional searches confirmed that no second person had been using the spaces and that every concealed route could be permanently sealed. Ross and Lia never spent another night in the house. They moved into temporary accommodation before eventually finding another property, and neither seriously considered returning once their belongings had been removed. The old crawl spaces were sealed during later building work, while police confirmed repeatedly that the man responsible remained in custody and posed no ongoing threat. Months later, Lia woke during the night in their new bedroom because she heard faint scratching from somewhere near the wall. Ross woke when she moved and listened beside her until the sound came again, after which he recognized a branch from the tree outside brushing against the brickwork in the wind. He checked through the window and confirmed there was nothing unusual before returning to bed, while Lia remained awake for several minutes longer and listened to the harmless scrape repeat at irregular intervals. She knew there was nobody inside the wall, and for once that certainty was completely justified, but the sound would never again belong entirely to mice, branches, or old houses. Somewhere in Lia's memory, it would always remain connected to the knowledge that a man had once moved through darkness only inches from where she slept, using his hands and knees to crawl silently behind the walls of a home she had believed was empty.